Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of What the Dementia by Bambu Care. I'm your host, Brianna Wilson. I'm a certified dementia practitioner and the founder of Bambu Care, where you can find us at letsbamboo.com because Bamboo is more than just a podcast. We have a variety of content and resources to help support dementia care partners along their caregiving journey. So today we're going to be answering the big question, can you prevent dementia? Now, for this episode, you may actually want to grab a pen and piece of paper if you can. I know a lot of you do other things while listening to our podcast, but this is one that you may want to wait before you take a listen or listen to it twice, and then take notes the second time around, okay? But whatever the case, please be sure to listen to this episode all the way through. And at the end, I will also be sharing what I think is the most helpful advice to reduce your risk for dementia. Before we get into today's topic, if you like the What the Dementia podcast, please be sure to give us a good rating to help other dementia care partners find our podcast. We'd really appreciate it. And if you would like to keep up with us between episodes, consider following us on Instagram at Let's Bamboo, joining us in our free support community at letsbamboo.com/champions, or sign up for our newsletter at letsbamboo.com/newsletter, okay? So, back to the topic. Can you prevent dementia? So let's clarify what we are actually talking about. When you ask the question, can you prevent dementia? What you are really asking is, can you prevent dementia from happening altogether? Not necessarily the reversal of symptoms once a person is diagnosed with the form of dementia, okay? And it's important for us to be clear on that so that you don't get confused and don't feel misled. I also want to be clear that when you ask, can you prevent dementia? We have to acknowledge that the prevention of dementia symptoms and the prevention of brain cell death, which is what happens with neurodegenerative forms of dementia, are related in their potential prevention methods. However, it must be understood that we are essentially talking about two different levels, for lack of a better word, of dementia. Now, there is a growing body of research out there about what is believed to contribute to symptoms of dementia, but the pathways leading to dementia are still not fully understood, and neither is what actually triggers brain cell death in the cases of neurodegenerative forms of dementia. And remember, not all forms of dementia are neurodegenerative and therefore progressive in nature, but all forms of dementia will impact daily functioning in a significant way. Now, I've been thinking a lot about how I wanted to present this topic because there are so many nuances, and if we're being honest, at this time, nobody really knows how to prevent dementia, any type of dementia. With that being said, most of the research that exists is for the prevention of Alzheimer's, but there are some studies that are specific to other types of dementias out there, okay? So my point is, because no one really knows, you will hear a lot of prevention recommendations and suggestions floating out there, some of which make good sense, some that contradict others, and some that are questionable at the least. So when we talk about prevention, reality tells us that what we are actually talking about is reducing risk factors that are known to some degree to increase the chances of developing dementia. So the theory is that if you manage the risk factors associated with dementia, then you decrease your chance of getting it. But listen closely. Reducing your risk does not mean that you won't still get dementia. Again, I repeat, nobody really knows how to prevent dementia. So before we dive deeper to address the blanket question, can you prevent dementia? The answer is maybe, but there's no way of knowing. There's no checkpoint. There's no marker of, yay, you did it, until you've died without dementia. Does that make sense? Now, just as a heads up, this podcast episode is going to be a mix of what research says and a mix of what Brianna says, okay? And I'll try to be clear when it's something Brianna says by saying, in my opinion, okay? But either way, feel free to take whatever I say with a grain of salt and do whatever feels best to you, okay? All right. So I think the easiest way to do this without getting too carried away and for you to better understand what I'm going to explain is to start with the brain. All forms of dementia impact the brain, and the brain controls everything, okay? So I'd say that this is a pretty good starting point. So, at minimum, generally speaking, what does the brain need to function properly? Now, I won't be able to hear you, but feel free to call things out. I'm going to list out 8, okay? So, 1, oxygen, a constant supply of oxygen. 2, glucose. The brain's primary source of energy is glucose. So, in order to function properly, the brain has to have just the right amount. Not too much, not too little. Because if that's the case, you'll have problems either way. Now, when you hear glucose, I want you to think carbs. Now, generally speaking, carbs get a bad rep, but there are healthy carbs and there are unhealthy carbs, and it's important to know the difference. In my opinion, a carb-free diet is more damaging than it is helpful when it comes to a lot of things, but definitely brain health. So the goal shouldn't be to avoid carbs, but to choose the right ones. Now, the brain can also use ketones to help meet its energy demands as well. And ketones can be produced and used by the body under the right conditions, which can be important, especially if your body has difficulty using glucose, which may be the case if you have something like diabetes, for example. Okay? Now, moving on. The third thing the brain needs is adequate blood flow. Why? Because it provides the brain with oxygen, which it needs a constant supply of, right? And nutrients, which leads us to our fourth thing, proper nutrition, especially amino acids from protein-rich foods. But again, there are proteins that are good for you, and there are proteins that are not. But your brain needs protein, okay? And then number 5 is also related to proper nutrition. Your brain needs hydration. In fact, the brain is very sensitive to dehydration. Studies actually show that you only need to be 1% dehydrated to experience a 5% decrease in cognitive function. A 2% decrease in hydration can actually result in short-term memory loss. And then prolonged dehydration causes brain cells to shrink in size and mass, which is obviously problematic, right? Now, the 6th is another big one that many of us do not do right by at all, and that is sleep. Our brain needs adequate sleep, and this is for a number of reasons. But 2 of the biggest reasons is that sleep facilitates the removal of toxic waste byproducts that accumulate in the brain while you're awake, and then sleep is necessary for the regeneration of neurons, okay? And then the 7th thing is stimulation. The brain needs stimulation. Stimulation helps the brain to grow new connections between brain cells and even generate new cells. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit as well. And then the 8th thing is protection. The brain must be protected from injuries, trauma, and toxins. So again, without all the added explanation, the 8 things that the brain needs at minimum to function properly is oxygen, glucose, blood flow, nutrition, hydration, sleep, stimulation, and protection. That means that the primary risk factors that can lead to dementia are going to be anything that directly or indirectly jeopardizes any of these things. Does that make sense? Now, research has suggested that about 40% of dementia cases can be attributed to modifiable risk factors. These are the ones that we have control over. So, what are the most common modifiable risk factors that we hear about? So, for one, vascular and cardiovascular risk factors like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart problems, and stroke, which the biggest known risk factor for a stroke is what? Hypertension. Okay? We also hear about smoking, alcohol consumption, physical inactivity, poor diet, So if you're eating a diet heavy in saturated fats, processed foods, and processed sugars, not so great, right? Depression, social isolation and loneliness, hearing impairments, lack of quality sleep, brain injuries, exposure to toxins such as lead, mercury, aluminum, carbon monoxide, mold, low education, and much of this is thought to do with believing those with less education have less cognitive reserve. And cognitive reserve is basically like a mental resilience or backup capacity that helps a person maintain cognitive abilities. It's basically the brain's resistance to damage, okay? Now, of course, there are two main risk factors that aren't so modifiable: age and genetics, right? Now, age is the number one risk factor for dementia. Now, in my opinion, age is the biggest risk factor because the longer you live, the more your bad and unhealthy habits, as well as exposures to toxins, compound, and the more at risk you are for social isolation and depression. So that makes sense to me. Now, with genetics, let's just focus on Alzheimer's disease as to not make this podcast too long and hard to digest. So, with Alzheimer's disease, we know that ApoE4 is the strongest genetic risk factor. Now, just because you are an ApoE4 carrier doesn't mean that you are going to automatically get Alzheimer's disease. It just means that you are at an increased risk, okay? Research has also shown that ApoE4 carriers seem to be more vulnerable to other risk factors like alcohol consumption, smoking, physical inactivity, and high intake of saturated fat. So, if you are a carrier, you just want to be mindful. But the reality is, we all need to be mindful, and we all need to prioritize our brain health in a holistic way, okay? So, with that being said, what can we do to address these risk factors? So, let's get the more obvious ones out the way first. To reduce your risk of getting dementia, don't smoke and don't drink. And if you do smoke or you do drink and you need support quitting, be sure to talk to your doctor. Also, protect your hearing. And if you already have a hearing impairment and you could benefit from hearing aids, make sure you are wearing them, okay? If you have issues with high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or diabetes, make sure that you are collaborating with your doctor to keep these things under control. Also, make sure that you are regularly checking your levels. That way, if a medication is not working and it's not actually managing your condition, you can better communicate to your doctor what's going on, okay? Also, make sure you're getting enough quality, restorative sleep. The brain needs both deep and REM sleep to be able to do its thing. If there's something keeping you from sleeping, address it, and if necessary, again, talk to your doctor. It is also recommended that you add at least 20 to 30 minutes of exercise and regular movement to your daily routine. Now, some sources will suggest high intensity aerobic exercise and strength training. But in my opinion, when it comes to exercise, you should do something that challenges you, but also feels good to you. If you feel miserable the entire time you are exercising, it could actually be doing more harm than good. But again, that's just my opinion, so do with that information what you will, okay? You also want to reduce bad stress. Bad stress increases cortisol levels in the body, and stress-associated cortisol has some pretty detrimental effects, especially if it's chronic. Now, the body does need some level of cortisol to function properly, but again, it's all about balance, and good stress is a thing too. Now, if you are a person who stresses out a lot, you want to find ways to manage that stress, whether it's seeking counseling, journaling, meditating, practicing mindfulness, exercising, whatever you need to do. Same thing goes if you struggle with depression, okay? Get help and address it. Get to the root of it, okay? Also, make sure you're keeping the brain stimulated. socialize, challenge yourself mentally, learn something new, read, continue doing things you enjoy, and then improve your diet. Now, the most commonly recommended diets for brain health are the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, and the MIND diet, which is like a hybrid of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. And I definitely suggest looking into them all. But here's what I will also say. In my opinion, every food that's labeled as healthy is not healthy for everybody. My biggest recommendation is to listen to your body. If you eat a food, whether it's considered healthy or not, listen to how your body is responding to it and how that food makes you feel. Our body is constantly communicating to us, but sometimes we just don't listen. I don't care if something says avocado is a superfood and it has healthy fats. If your body doesn't respond well to avocado, don't eat avocado. Eat something else, okay? Just as if you were allergic to strawberries and you hear how great strawberries are, you still wouldn't choose to eat strawberries, would you? No, because you are allergic, right? So, same thing applies. And then lastly, protect your brain from toxins and from injury. Our environment is full of toxins, and sometimes we just can't avoid them. Now, some people will do things like changing their cleaning products, hair products, and hygiene products to more green, less toxic products, things like that. But heck, everything seems a little bit toxic nowadays, which is why getting good sleep so that your brain can detoxify itself while you rest is so important. Now, with that being said, the brain can only do so much, even with the help of nutritious foods and even supplements in some cases, adequate water, and blood flow. And so, depending on what you've been exposed to, like mold or some type of infection, for example, that's where appropriate medical intervention comes into play, okay? But all in all, reducing your risk for dementia is possible. It's just that there is no way to 100% guarantee that you won't still develop dementia. So, to conclude this episode, I want to share what I think is the most helpful advice to reduce your risk for dementia. And that is protect your mental health and stay connected to life. What does that mean, Brianna? That means if you are dealing with any stress, trauma, or depression, it is so important that you find healthy, productive ways to address it and seek help, okay? But why? Why is this so important? Because what you are experiencing internally impacts your connection to life, your presence, your desire to be a part of the life experience. And to me, that is honestly the biggest risk factor for developing dementia, internally disconnecting from life in the physical realm. So you have to find ways to still find joy in this life and to appreciate the physical experience. You also have to pay attention to the things that are impacting your mental health. And sometimes that even includes your environment, people, your routine, and the foods you are eating. And I want to mention this because I'll often hear people say things like, my dad ate healthy, never drank, never smoked, ran 5 miles every day, was the top engineer at his company, and still got dementia. And though that may be true, no one mentions dad's mental health and what he may have been dealing with internally because he always put on a good face. He always took care of everybody else, and he never let anyone know how he was really feeling inside. Or maybe he did, and people just shrugged it off because, after all, dad's always okay. Look at him, right? The reality is we never really know what people are going through, and same holds true for you. People may not really know what's going on with you, but you know who does? You do, okay? And this is not something I am saying or sharing lightly. It's because it's actually something I've experienced for myself. So, with all that being said, do with that information what you will, and please do what you feel is best for you, okay? But that wraps up everything that I wanted to share today about preventing dementia. If you find our podcast helpful, please consider leaving us a review to help other dementia caregivers find the podcast. Of course, if anyone has any questions, comments, or future podcast requests, you can always send us an email at podcast@whatthedementia.com. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of What the Dementia by Bambu Care. We look forward to catching you on the next episode. Take care, and until next time, stay strong, care on, and remember, you are not alone. Bambu Care is always here.